Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today we have a new one trying out here. First, let me introduce, you know him, you love him, Mike Powers. Hey Mike.
Hey Andy, thank you for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So for those people who are wondering what's going on, Mike and I thought we'd do a different style of episode where it's not just a formal interview. Mike's been on before with the Retirement Planner Chat thing. Mike guest hosted a handful of weeks ago. And Mike also interviewed me one time on the show, but we thought, let's just have sort of a sit down where Mike and I rap about some common questions or concerns or topics that we've seen in the news or that we've seen people express, whether through the Facebook group or otherwise, or our own clients in our practice. And just had this be really informal. He and I would just kind of share our thoughts. Maybe we'll agree, maybe we'll disagree. We did not bang out ahead of time what our views or perspectives are going to be. So
for better or for worse.
Yeah, for better or for worse. And I think that's going to be part of the fun of this. He and I both respect each other, so I know if we do disagree on something, it's going to be cordial and constructive, which hopefully is good for you all listening. I don't know, anything else to add to this, Mike? I'm kind of making this up as we go here.
No, I mean, that sounds great, Andy. I'm excited for today, but I guess one question I do have for you before we kick it off is you had mentioned in a previous episode that you and your family got a new dog right around the holidays, I believe. So just want to see how is the dog doing? How is she adjusting to life with your family? How are you guys adjusting to life with? Is it Moose?
It is Moose.
Moose.
Yes. It's good so far. It's a lot of work and adjustment to life, which we expected because Moose is a puppy. He's not quite 4 months old. As far as puppies go, he's really well mannered, behaved. I mean, he has puppy energy and stuff like that. And we're still in the process of house training, but he's good. Interesting story. He almost died getting a vaccine a few weeks ago. So There's something called distemper, which is whatever disease or dog condition that they get vaccinated for. And the place we got him from, the breeder said he already had his first distemper shot when he was like 2 weeks old or something and didn't inform us of any issues. We went to the vet for his first visit after we got him, and they did the booster to the distemper vaccine. And the vet said, if you notice anything like nausea, lethargic or whatever, bring him back immediately or go to an animal hospital. I was like, oh, that's weird. I never knew like these things could be that potentially dangerous. I just thought they were doing CYA. So he gets the shot. We're driving home, and within about 10 minutes, he starts dry heaving in the back seat. So we call the vet and like, yeah, bring him back immediately. So we bring him back, give the dog to the vet. You know, we wait in the waiting room. The dog's in the back room. The vet comes out like 20 minutes later and says, we almost have him stabilized. I was like,
wow.
What do you mean almost stabilized? And so long story short, what happened was he had an allergic reaction. He started going into shock and his body was shutting down. She said his gums were white. His blood pressure dropped. He was basically non-responsive.
Oh my gosh.
So they had to like flush out his stomach with some sort of fluid. That didn't work. They gave him an IV of some kind of steroid and like Benadryl thing. They ultimately got him stable, and he had to stay there for a few hours until they were comfortable and confident that yes, he's fine now. And he was. But now going forward, anytime he gets whatever vaccine, they're going to have to pre-medicate him with some kind of steroid and Benadryl in sort of anticipation of potential reactions. Anyway, wow. So he's fine though, thankfully. But it was a scary moment to have him, almost not make it from what I believe is just a routine vaccine that most, if not all, dogs get.
Yeah, I'm glad that they gave you a heads up too before all of that, just so you kind of knew to watch out for it.
Right. But we would have just thought he was like car sick or something on the way home, and would have thought nothing of it. But
yeah.
So Moose is good though. But yes, other than almost dying, Moose is good, and family likes him. I think he likes us. And all is well.
Great.
So, all right.
Great.
I just wanted to ask you, when does Sean Connery arrive at Wimbledon?
I don't know.
10-ish. What?
Nice.
Oh man.
Should have gotten that one. Okay.
Yeah. All right. How do you want to kick this off here? So Mike and I have a list of questions. We sort of, not questions, but topics we batted around that we're going to discuss. And outside of that, there's really no structure here.
Yeah, well, so I guess my thought is, why don't we start off with there's been a lot of talk recently about tariffs, and within your private Facebook group, you had actually, I thought, did a really good job of kind of laying out what is a tariff, how does it work, how does it potentially impact it, and I think what on a lot of people's mind is, does that going to impact inflation, right? That's kind of the lot of noise that you've been hearing within the news because it's been so, kind of front and center for the last at least month or two now. So if you don't mind just kind of rehashing that, I think you did a phenomenal job. I'm probably not going to have a ton to add to that outside of just some other additional thoughts maybe as we kind of go through it, but.
Sure. So yes, hot topic, and we're trying to make this as apolitical as possible, but
Yes.
there are recent tariffs introduced or proposed or / threatened that are, coming out of the current administration. So start with, what is a tariff? It's in effect just an extra tax that is applied on importing something from abroad. It could be a particular product. It could be a whole sector of products. It could be anything from a given country. But in effect, it makes it more expensive for U.S. consumers or U.S. businesses to now get something from abroad. There's a lot of misunderstanding about who actually pays it, not even trickling down to inflation to consumers yet. I'll touch on that. But who actually pays the tariff? The tariff is paid by U.S. importers. So example would be, we buy maple syrup from Canada, let's say. There's an exporter in Canada who has the trees, who gets the syrup, who puts it in bottles and ships it, sells it to the U.S. There's going to be a U.S.-based importer who actually buys that syrup from the Canadian manufacturer. That importer then turns around and sells it to wholesalers or retailers within the U.S. The misconception is that the foreign producer, the Canadian maple syrup company in this case, is the one who pays this extra tax. That is false. The tax is paid by the US-based importer. So whereas, let's assume it costs $100 for a bucket of, maple syrup before, to buy it from the Canadian company, and let's assume now there's a 10% tariff, the US importer now has to pay $110. 100 of which goes to the Canadian manufacturer. The $10 tariff / tax gets paid to the US government. The importer pays it. And so, it's false to say the foreign company pays it. The US importer pays it. Now, how does that potentially manifest itself in terms of higher prices and inflation? Almost always, this will result in some amount of inflation to the US consumer. Because in this case, what used to be $100 that the US importer would pay for this Canadian syrup, that they would then charge, let's say, $105 to the wholesaler in the US, who turns around and sells it to, the grocery stores for $110, who sell it to consumers for whatever, $120. It's now that much more expensive at the start of this whole, flow. So that has to get eaten by someone somewhere. The importers might eat some of it. And instead of charging 105 to the wholesalers, they'll charge whatever, 109, and so they'll eat some of this tariff. Maybe the foreign manufacturers eat some of it by charging a little less to the wholesaler, maybe not. And then anyone else involved in that supply chain, the wholesaler, the retailer, they may eat some of the price. But ultimately, the consumer is going to end up paying something more. How much more depends, but they'll be paying something more, all else equal, because simply the product costs that much more to get in the first place. And so why do tariffs? I don't know. It depends who you ask. There's lots of different views. They're a way to try to exert some sort of control or get something out of the foreign government or foreign manufacturer in this case. Because in theory, if you make it more expensive for people in the US to buy their product, then people in the US may shop elsewhere. They may buy syrup from a US-based manufacturer that doesn't have this tariff, hence it could be less expensive to buy. So then that means, in theory, the demand for the Canadian manufacturer's syrup can go down. They're going to have less revenue. They may have to lay off employees. They may now have less income tax within Canada to go to the government, et cetera. So it's a way to try to exert some control. If there's something you want from the Canadian government or from these manufacturers and they're not responding, you can squeeze them with a tariff, and in theory, that'll get their attention. But economically, sort of everyone's a little worse off as a result. Now, it doesn't mean tariffs are inherently bad. I personally think they're an ineffective way. They can get what you want. Like they can ultimately force someone to concede to whatever it is you're trying to get them to do or not do. But in the interim, you're going to have some pain. Like people will be paying higher prices. And so currently, given that inflation was one of like the main economic concerns of people in the U.S., to now institute tariffs, which will almost certainly directly relate to more inflation, is sort of like a, I don't know, not something people want to hear or have to stomach.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there for now, but that's kind of tariffs in a nutshell.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And just for the audience listening, we're recording this on February 25th. So who knows what will happen after we record, between recording and
Right.
and it going live, the show going live and everything. But I think that's really well said, Andy. So thank you for all that. I mean, one of the fears that I've heard lately, or at least kind of concerns that I've heard from clients, is, do these tariffs directly cause inflation, or are they going to experience higher inflation for the things that they kind of purchase on a daily basis? Should we be assuming a higher inflationary rate for financial planning purposes? And obviously, with anything else, who knows, right? This could end up going a number of different ways. You could think about it, at least on my end, I think about it, tariffs could technically hurt GDP growth a little bit, right? Because if everything costs more, people could be actually purchasing less goods to begin with, if you have theoretically the same dollar amount to spend. There's a lot of other factors out there. Just to name one other obvious one, I think that's in the news right now, a lot of layoffs, at least, on the government side. How does that kind of impact inflation as people are looking for employment elsewhere? And I know there's the various buyout packages and everything that have been going on, and some severance options. So maybe that's more intermediate term versus in the next few months. But if I'm just putting myself in someone else's shoes and I've just been laid off, I'm probably spending less money, at least in the short term, until I've lined up a new employment as well, right? So yeah. I think there's a lot of other things that in play that, even if the tariffs were cause inflation, that doesn't necessarily mean that we will have a higher inflationary environment just by that itself, because there's so many other factors out there that come into, what at least U.S. consumers pay for a price of goods. So
yeah, that's true. Like all things macroeconomic related, there's so many intertwined variables. It's really hard to isolate just one thing. Like, yes, all else equal, tariffs should or likely will translate to higher prices, if nothing else, on those things that are tariffed. But to your point, if a lot of people get laid off, consumer sentiment drops, there's less discretionary income to go around because there's less people who now have jobs, that could sort of counteract and reduce overall demand, and thus kind of reduce prices and offset the inflationary pressure there might otherwise be from tariffs on things. So it's really hard to say, and I agree with you. Who knows? Will there actually be more inflation or not going forward? And if so, how much of it's directly related to tariffs? I don't know that we'll ever be able to isolate that and figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, and just interesting, there's a really good book I read like 20 years ago relating to tariffs and such. It's called The Choice. It's like The Choice, a fable of free trade and protectionism or something like that. And it's a fiction, but a lot of the concepts I think make a lot of sense. It was like 1960s or 70s, I don't remember when. It was about the auto industry, I believe, and how, in the 70s-ish, I guess it was, a lot of the manufacturing and auto buying kind of transitioned from the big three in the U.S. to Japan and abroad. And that obviously hurt places like Detroit and places that were really focused around manufacturing related to auto. So lots of layoffs, lots of depression within those local areas. And the government's natural response would be, well, let's help protect that. Let's put tariffs on the importing of foreign cars to make those more expensive, so people will now kind of force their hand to buy more US-based cars. And the gist is that doing it that way can indeed preserve some US auto manufacturing jobs, but you could just be propping up what could potentially be a zombie or an inefficient industry, forcing people to buy cars that may be inferior to Japan, Japanese cars at the time. And while you might be saving that local community and or propping up that local industry, in the short term. In the long term, you're actually holding people back. You may not be keeping generations of families in these environments or industries that might kind of be slowly dying over time, as opposed to if they do have other choices or options or are forced to look elsewhere for schooling or jobs, longer term they can, progress and end up being better off than if they stayed in, status quo. So it's interesting read. Again, it's a fable, but I think a lot of the principles hold true, and the idea of protectionism and using tariffs to try to help bolster certain industries or economies could actually backfire and be counterproductive. Food for thought with that read. But anyway.
Yeah, I'm impressed you remember the storyline that well 20 years later.
It really resonated with me. I was like, wow, this makes so much sense. And, you can equate it to different industries, the Rust Belt and the Auto Belt and the, industries that were powerhouses, steel in the U.S., right? You go to like parts of Pennsylvania that were steel powerhouses now are just shells of themselves. If you were to have artificially supported those industries by slapping really large tariffs on steel from abroad, who knows what they would have looked like now? They could be really inefficient and actually do more harm to the economy than good. Now, I know these are sensitive topics. People who are directly impacted by auto layoffs, steel layoffs, it could be devastating to you, your family, your local community. So I don't mean to speak of this nonchalantly, but as a whole, in the aggregate, protectionism and trying to protect industries that are just kind of inefficiently not holding their own aren't the best policies. Again, they help local families and stuff, and to them, that's all that really matters at the end of the day. But bigger picture, tariffs and protectionism generally aren't good things, all said and done.
Yeah.
All right. So that's tariffs. Next, I'll leave this to you because I believe you to be more sort of knowledgeable and have thought more critically and seriously about these than I have. But tips, Treasury inflation protected securities. People have asked, like going into what some suspect will be higher inflation, should I be holding or buying tips as opposed to bank accounts or normal, non-tip government bonds?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually wrote a blog post. It was fairly in depth on this sometime last year. I'll see if we can link to this in the show notes. But and that may even be a lot better than I'm about to talk through it today. A lot better communication style. So we'll see how I can do on the fly here. But basically, what I would say as a backstory is, I've been in financial planning now 15 or so years, and for almost my entire career, we think back. Inflation really hasn't been that high, and because of that, tips really have not been an attractive investment vehicle. Now we can go back a couple of years, and obviously we had higher inflation, especially in like 2022, for a brief period there, and now it's come down, sub 3%. I think for 2024 was the last reading that I saw. But if you invested in tips for the last, call it 15 years or so, outside the last year or two, you were basically getting zero, or even at some points and over that time period, what's called a real negative yield. So you were literally investing in tips, betting that inflation was going to be higher than kind of the prevailing rate, just because yields were so low across the board. So it's hard to get excited about investing in something where you're basically guaranteed to lose money, right? Yeah. Net of inflation. So
and can you just mechanically at a high level, how do tips work? So people who aren't familiar with them know.
Yeah, great. And I was getting to that, but yeah, great.
Okay, sorry to steal your thunder.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to set it up. So mechanically, tips are fixed income or bond investment vehicle that you are essentially purchasing that has two components. The first component is that it's paying some interest rate. Now, it might be a very low interest rate, but some interest rate that it's actually paying. And then it also has a component for an inflation adjustment. And so that inflation adjustment actually adjusts every 6 months based on CPI, or Consumer Price Index. So essentially it's two components that you're investing in. So this is different than investing in traditional US Treasuries, where you're essentially just getting a fixed rate or a discount on it if you're buying like a T-bill, but essentially a fixed rate of interest for the time horizon that you are invested in that Treasury. The only fluctuations that really are happening are because of, during that time period, are because of movements in interest rates, and therefore a corresponding potential change in value in what you're invested in. But even that doesn't matter if you're holding it to maturity. So adding the inflation component makes it a little bit more of a unique investment vehicle by doing this. Now, TIPS, just like U.S. Treasuries, are backed by the U.S. government, so it still has the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. It doesn't mean it's a 0% chance of default, right? There's obviously always a chance something could happen, but it's very, very low risk. And there's a couple different ways you can invest in it. You can invest in it either directly by purchasing TIPS either at auction or on the secondary market through custodians or large brokerage firms. You can invest in it through like a normal ETF or mutual fund where it has what's called a rolling yield, and we can talk more about that here in a minute as well. But basically, you're just investing in a large number of TIPS, similar to like a large number of short-term treasuries or long-term treasuries, whatever kind of you're picking. There actually are a couple of different options as far as like ideal durations in there, either short-term or long-term TIPS, and both have their pros and cons. Or there's actually even newer products, and I don't have the names of them off the top of my head, but I think it's like an iShares or BulletShares. Not recommending any of these, but there are newer products out there where there's actually like a set duration. So you can essentially just say like, I'm investing in TIPS that are going to mature in 2028. And so it's basically a basket of TIPS that mature in 2028. Essentially that investment firm is actually doing the management of the TIPS for you and purchasing those TIPS for you, and then you're for a management fee or essentially just an expense ratio within the fund. So rather than you have to think about what TIPS am I going to purchase, you just purchase this ETF and it's going to mature at that, whenever the stated maturity date is. So when I think about investing in TIPS, the first reason is, if I'm going to invest personally, the first reason is, why am I doing this, right? Why am I investing in TIPS? Am I going to need the money 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 7 years, 10 years, whatever that is? And do I not want to take stock market risk, which has actually been historically a very good hedge with inflation? Now we can talk more about it here later on too, about potential stock market returns over the intermediate and term horizon. I have some thoughts on that I'd like to share too. But if you're truly looking for like an inflation hedge and you're worried about suboptimal stock market returns, especially here in the US, TIPS can be a great hedge without having that stock market volatility. So if you know in the time horizon that you're going to need the money, in my mind, you're better off investing in individual TIPS versus a TIPS fund, because you don't have to worry about the change in interest rates over that time horizon. So if I know I'm going to need $100,000 5 years from now, well, I can buy a TIP that's going to mature within that 5-year time horizon, and I know whatever interest rates do over the next 5 years, I don't care, because I'm getting those dollars back, plus or minus any inflation or deflation over that time frame. Whereas if I have no idea, I may need this money 10 years, I may need this money 15 years from now, 5 years from now, maybe with these TIPS funds, it just are either short-term or long-term, whatever you're looking for, are a better option for you, just to have some of that inflation hedge. So that's really what I'm going through when I think through this. I have certainly started using them more frequently than before, just to help kind of hedge some inflation risk. This is not necessarily a recommendation for listeners to use this, just saying that personally, within the clients that I work with, I have been utilizing them more often now than I used to. And I guess one of those reasons too, again, coming back, is because TIPS have been more attractive. You're actually, at least last year, you were getting actually a pretty decent, quote unquote, real return of, let's call it 2-ish%, give or take, depending on the duration. It's pretty nice to earn 2%. Inflation is 3% and you're earning 2%. All of a sudden, it's a 5% rate of return with very little volatility. Nowhere near the risk that you're taking in the stock market. So I was actually looking this morning at just kind of current tips yields versus Treasury yields, just to kind of give people an idea. And this easily could change later today or tomorrow or whatever, but at least as of right now, the real yield for like a 2-year tips, at least on the secondary market right now, is about 1.3%. 4 years was about 1.5%, and then 10 years was a little bit under 2, about 1.9%. Now that's compared to traditional treasuries right now that are yielding over those time horizons anywhere between like 4.1 and 4.3%. So what essentially the market is doing is it's assuming an inflation rate of about 2.8% over the next 2 years and about 2.4% over the next 10 years. So if you're investing in tips, you're kind of making a bet that inflation is going to be at least, let's just say, let's use the 10-year numbers, at least 2.4% or higher. If your only two options you're looking at are investing in treasuries versus investing in tips. So in my mind, if you're investing in tips and especially if you're retired, one of the reasons to do it is, hey, if inflation is high, this is a great bet. If inflation is low, that's okay because my spending has also not increased that much. So in my mind, for retirees, this can be a really great strategy to use for at least some portion of your fixed income, because we still want the tip to not do well because we want lower inflation as a retiree, right? So that's kind of my logic for it. The one other thing that I'll mention, and then happy to answer any other thoughts or questions that you might have, Andy, but unlike traditional bonds, when bonds are paying out, you're actually getting the actual interest unless you reinvest it. You're actually getting the interest payments in cash. The inflation adjustment on tips is just an adjustment in the principal. And so what that is doing is if you hold these outside of an IRA or a retirement account, and just like in a taxable brokerage or a trust account, it's creating a tax liability or taxable income and tax liability for you without giving you the money, the cash to pay that tax liability. So you just need to be mindful of that, especially if you're like around the border for IRMA or like some other tax planning strategy. You need to be mindful of, you're going to have these inflation adjustments, and you're going to need to have the cash to actually pay the tax liability on these inflation adjustments. So you don't want to put everything in tips and then have no liquidity where you can't actually pay the tax bill. Yeah. So that's just one other kind of nuance. I think that's a little bit different in tips versus something else.
So the face value or par value or principal value is, let's say, $1,000 per bond. The interest rate you get paid is a fixed percentage, so whatever, 4%, let's say. But the principal increases over time if there's inflation. And so you're getting 4% of a larger principal amount. When the bond matures, are you actually getting that larger principal paid off, or that larger principal is just used to figure out the interest?
So that larger principal is actually what's paying out.
That is what
so let's just say it like doubles in 30 years. The larger principal, that's what you actually get.
Okay, got it. Yeah, we discussed these with our friend Larry Pershing before, and my thought was, if you're using a tips, like you said, you're inherently kind of guessing or thinking that inflation is going to be the same or higher than what the market currently assumes it's going to be or projects it's going to be going forward. If it's not, if inflation ends up being lower than what is assumed by the market today, a regular, normal, nominal treasury, in hindsight, will have been better. And so I said to Larry, I don't really get into tips because I feel like that's taking a bet on inflation, and I feel like betting on inflation is no different than betting on the stock market. Like, I don't know what's going to happen, higher or lower than average. Larry was brilliant. He turned it around and said, well, by you using normal treasuries, you're inherently betting that you think inflation is going to be lower than the market predicts. I was like, ooh, touche. Yeah. So I don't know. I like your viewing and framing of it and how to think about it. If inflation is lower, it's not the end of the world. Like, it just means you're spending less on stuff, so you win there, even though you end up doing a little less better on your tip than you would have liked to. Yeah. I got really nothing else to add. I'm trying to keep thinking about these and see or think if they make sense. I don't know why I haven't yet said, okay, 100%, let's do tips. I still get stuck on a tips is really betting on inflation, and I don't like taking that bet. But to Larry's point, you can say I'm betting on inflation being lower than expected by using normal bonds. So I don't know. I guess I'm a little,
Well, and there are some downside risks too, right? They are not as liquid in very volatile markets. They're probably not going to be as liquid as like a normal treasury, right? Because you have more buyers of treasuries.
Yeah.
All these big institutions, everything else, that is, treasury is kind of like quote unquote the risk-free rate, right? So huge corporations, countries are buying and selling treasuries all day, every day. Tips is a much smaller market, and you have a much smaller availability. And you could find treasuries to mature almost within every 2 weeks for like the next several years, if not the next 20 years, on the secondary market and stuff. For tips, depending on how far you go out, you might even find like some years, like an entire year where there's no tips maturing, at least that are available to buy right now. So it's not all upside potential, right? There are some cons. There are some cons there as well, but you just need to kind of think through what are you trying to solve for, and what do you feel most comfortable with for your fixed income. So
I think, just to kind of wrap on this, I don't think tips are bad. I don't think anyone who chooses to use them, advisors or consumers alike, are making wrong choices. It's just a choice. It's like anything. There's different ways to try to achieve different things, as long as you're aware of the pros, the cons, what you think you want out of it. So be it. And I think on the flip side, I want to believe people would look at me and say, okay, you choose to not use tips, use regular bonds. Makes sense, right? It's a choice. You're aware of what you're potentially giving up or gaining either way. So, I don't know. That's kind of you got any final thoughts on that, on tips?
No, I think just do your homework. If you're going to invest in it directly and do it yourself, especially, I know there's probably a lot of DIY investors that listen to this show. Just make sure you really understand it well, and make sure you know what you're getting into before doing anything. That, just like any other investment option, it's just a little bit more complicated than your standard fixed income.
Well said.
And really go back to the purpose of why do you want bonds in the first place, right? And then I think that can help solve for it as well.
Sure. Yeah, great point. Stocks, U.S. versus international stocks, and a lot of people have very strong opinions around this. I'll let you just kick it off with anything you want to say here.
Yeah, so I have been a big believer in a broadly diversified portfolio for pretty much my entire career. And again, if we look back at history, the last 14 or 15 years have been basically gangbusters for U.S. stocks, and not so much for international stocks. So this can get to be a little bit of a harder sell, so to speak, or a harder thought process to kind of believe in your convictions and kind of stay with this. But there's a couple of things that I kind of think about when I think about U.S. stocks versus international stocks. Now, one thing that I like to show, and I take this with a grain of salt, there are a lot of people out there that are paid economists to kind of forecast, based on current valuations and everything else, what are stocks, bonds, et cetera, likely to do over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And I really like Vanguard's economic update that they put out there. Right now, they have U.S. stocks from their last update, which was December. U.S. stocks over the next 10 years, they are predicting U.S. stocks like 3 to 5%, which is well below historical averages, with inflation around 2 to 3%. So basically, they have U.S. stocks beating inflation by like 1 or 2%, theoretically. Again, who knows what's actually going to happen over the next 10 years. But that's where they are. They have their predictions. Obviously, difference between growth and value and small cap and large cap, so on and so forth. But overall, U.S. stock market, that's what they have, which is very, very low from an historical period. However, if you look at international stocks, they have the range right now between roughly 7 and 9%. That's a huge difference. It's more than it's almost a double outperformance on both the bottom and top side. Again, who knows what will happen, but at least from Vanguard's economists, they certainly are predicting higher rates of return for international stocks versus U.S. stocks. And if we go back to the quote unquote lost decade, which was basically 2001 to 2009, U.S. stocks were basically break even or slightly negative, depending on whether or not you include dividends in there over that, over almost a 10-year time period. International stocks actually performed decently well. So we don't have to go back that far from a historical perspective where you actually had a pretty nice diversification benefit for having exposure outside of the U.S. stocks. Now, a lot of American investors have a very strong conviction that U.S. stocks will outperform. And I think just about every investor has what's called a home country bias. Now, your home country bias is probably not as hurtful in the U.S. as it may be in a much smaller country. Let's say you live in Denmark. I actually can't think of Denmark's stock market performance over the last 25 years. But obviously Denmark's stock market performance compared to the overall world market cap is very, very small percentage of what would make up the total return. So you obviously are taking on more risk within that as well. But if we even look at it from a little bit different perspective, and if you look at current PE ratios, so a price to earnings ratio, and what are you paying essentially for a dollar of earnings in the US compared to what are you paying for a dollar of earnings internationally? Right now, the US stock market is around 26.8. That's for looking at VTI, which is the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index. ETF is just a very low cost one. International stocks using the ticker VXUS, which is the total international stock index, essentially XUS, it's around 16. So U.S. stocks, just from that valuation point, are about 67% higher. So that's not necessarily meaning. So don't say, hey, Mike, how could you possibly? I've been working in international business. I've traveled the world. I think that U.S. economy is definitely the place to go. I'm not necessarily saying that international businesses are better. I'm just saying you're paying more for a price of earnings, a dollar of earnings in the U.S. than you are internationally. So it's just another way that I look at it, to where, from a historical perspective, U.S. stocks are certainly on the higher side, whereas international stocks are closer to kind of the average. So just a couple of ways to look at it. Again, that's kind of where I think of it. But if you have a strong conviction where you're U.S., I completely understand that. But you might want to think about, what if you're wrong? If you're wrong and everything's in the U.S., you're not going to have the same diversification benefit as you would if you're wrong and you have a decent international allocation. I still hope that international outperforms, because I still have a higher allocation to U.S. stocks. But
right.
I'll pause there because I've talked a lot.
I think another thing people might be thinking, a lot of people listening are probably fans of J.L. Collins and A Simple Path to Wealth.
Yes. Yep.
Great insight, great commentary. And I can't really say I disagree with much, if any, of it. I have a different opinion about his view on international stocks. So J.L. Collins' view is simply holding the S&P 500 or U.S. total stock market of U.S. companies. They have enough indirectly international exposure, like Apple, for example. Think about how many phones and whatever computers it sells throughout Asia, throughout Europe. Microsoft, same thing. So his view is there's enough international exposure already in U.S. total market. You don't need true international stocks, and he advocates for not having international stocks. That's his opinion. My opinion is different. I see where he's coming from and fully agree that large U.S. multinational companies do have a lot of international influences to their performance. But it's not the same as having truly international exposure, where there's different local geopolitical and macroeconomic forces at play. There's foreign exchange rates at play to some extent. It's just not quite as international. The diversification isn't quite as much if you only hold U.S. companies versus true international. And to your point, since the global financial crisis, U.S. stock market has absolutely dominated the rest of the world. It's been mostly driven by the large mega cap, big top 10 names in the S&P: Amazon, Google, Apple, Microsoft, whatever. Most recently, Nvidia, Tesla. But still, the U.S. market has significantly outperformed the rest of the world. So I get sort of the recency bias and the home country bias, and people saying, why would I invest in the rest of the world stock market when over the last 15 years, U.S. has consistently beat it? And I say, I get it. Like you said, though, the last decade of 2000-ish to the financial crisis, different story. U.S. took the brunt of the financial crisis. The whole world hurt, but the U.S. took the brunt of it. So comparatively speaking, international stocks did noticeably better. Who knows if and when the tides will change, but I think it's prudent to have some allocation to international stocks outside of just your U.S. multinational stuff, like in the total stock market. I'm not saying the U.S. is going to get dethroned as the world's predominant economy. I don't think that's happening in our lifetimes. I mean, that could be an ignorant statement, but I do think, to your point, U.S. stock market looks to be objectively very expensive, rather overvalued, especially compared to the stock markets of the rest of the world. For what it's worth, this is just one small data point, and anything can change, but year to date, as of February 25th, 2025, the Vanguard total stock market fund is up about 1.5% for the year. Vanguard's total international, excluding U.S., is up about 6%. Now, again, this could be nothing. This could be completely different in a week. But I think the forces, the sentiment, the sort of feelings in the air that, okay, maybe the U.S. is going to comparatively pause a bit to the rest of the world stock market. So I'm fully on board personally and professionally with having a decent chunk of stock exposure to international. How much is a decent chunk? That's up to each individual. Just picking a number, I think anywhere from 20 to 40% of your stock exposure being international is defensible. If you want to look at the whole globe, the U.S. accounts for roughly 60%, I think, of the global market capitalization of the whole stock market of the world. International is the other 40. Now, I'm not saying people need to mimic the global allocation of stock, but just so you know, globally speaking, international is pretty big. It's nearly a half, 40% or whatever. So do with that as you please. I'm an advocate of true international stock exposure, not just indirectly through U.S. stocks, but I also can't blame you, and I get why you'd want to have only U.S. stocks, especially if you're looking at the last 15 years and, letting that guide your decision making. So. And U.S. stocks pay higher dividends too, for what it's worth. I'm not a fan of investing just for dividends, but for those of you who do like dividends and feel good from it, U.S. stocks are more like 3 to 4% dividends, whereas S&P 500 is like 1.5%, not even dividend payout currently.
You mean international stocks have higher dividends?
Yes, I'm sorry if I said that backwards.
Yeah. I think we said yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's all I got on U.S. versus international.
Yeah, the only other argument I'll have there, or I think point that you made already, was just the kind of the J.L. Collins simple path to wealth and having a lot of exposure to international markets through U.S. companies. I would argue that the counter of that is also true, from a standpoint of international companies also have consumers in the U.S. right? And so they would actually have the same thing. And so anyway, it's just another way to still get exposure to U.S. consumers, just a backwards way. So anyway. All right.
In the Facebook group, there have been a lot of posts, some of which we've had to delete or turn off comments about, given what's going on, the world's going to end. Should I sell out of stocks? Should I have more cash, et cetera? For those listening, if you were someone where you had to delete your comment or turn it off, if I can just kindly ask you to rephrase that, don't lead with, given who's in office or given the environment, whatever. Just say, if I wanted to reduce the risk in my portfolio, keep it as neutral and apolitical as possible, and strip out opinions as much as possible. Because once you start interjecting opinions in political commentary, just comments go off the rails real quickly. So, but with that said, there were multiple people asking this kind of thing. If you have uncertainty and if you want to reduce the risk in your portfolio, or another way to look at it, increase the amount of cash you're holding. Maybe you're coming up on retirement soon and want to beef up your cash holdings. What are your thoughts on this idea, Mike?
Yeah, you may, I don't know if you have a rule of thumb or not that you go by. I actually look at it on a case-by-case basis per client. And there's a number of other things variables that I consider outside of this, but the main ones are basically, number one, what are you going to need? What big expenses or cash needs are you going to have in the next few years, right? Because we really don't want to take stock market risk with anything that we know is going to be short-term in nature, just because you're not going to have the benefit of time on your side to allow it to hopefully correct over that. So you really want to be, really consider big expenses in there. Let's say you're buying a new house. It's going to be $700,000 2 years from now, or whatever that dollar amount is, depending on the market and where you live. And you're planning on paying cash for it. You probably don't want to be all equities, right? So you probably want to have that in something a lot more secure. Because if all of a sudden houses go on sale before that, let's just say we have some kind of economic pullback and houses in the area you're looking at go down in value. Well, you don't want the stocks that you're invested in to also have gone down in value even more than what you're about to save potentially on the home purchase. So I think having cash on the sidelines for those big ticket items makes a lot of sense. If you're taking a higher distribution rate from your portfolio, especially like in the earlier years of retirement, while you're delaying Social Security or a pension or something else that you're waiting to kind of kick in, having at least a higher allocation to bonds and or cash may make a lot of sense too. Again, because you don't have that time on your side, and you really want to hedge that risk in the short term until the rest of your income comes online. Now, conversely, I think about it from, let's say that you're retired between pensions, Social Security, whatever else you have coming in. Let's even ignore investment assets. Let's say you might be covering all of your living expenses or even saving money. I've even seen, worked with clients in the past or even now that are literally saving money in retirement. Now, you probably don't need much, if any, of a cash cushion, right? Now, maybe you can afford to take less risk if you're just worried about a lot of uncertainty that's going on there globally. But from a cash need, you really don't have a huge, if everything is covered, you really don't have a huge need to have that cash outside of maybe an emergency fund or cash cushion or whatever you want to kind of call it there. And then I'm happy to talk about kind of where to park that cash. But Andy, do you want to chime in on any of that first?
Yeah, I think start with, ideally you should have a plan. Don't just get yourself more cash because you're scared. That's market timing. That's letting emotions drive thing. Like you said, in Cody Garrett, who most of you or a lot of you may have heard of or know, has this phrase, and maybe he didn't coin it, but I'll pretend he did. Money should have a use by date.
Yeah, I like that.
All your dollars, all your investments, all your whatever should be there for something. So if you have a house you're going to buy in 6 months and 1 year, you do not want that money at risk of dropping much, if at all. So that money, however much it is, maybe it's 100 grand, maybe it's 500 grand you need, that should be very safe and stable. Expenses as well, just day-to-day living expenses. If you're only going to have 40 grand of Social Security coming in, but you have 100 grand of expenses you need, that's 60 grand a year of cash you're going to need for the next 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Then maybe you want to make sure you have that much cash sidelined. So if the markets do get nasty, you have safe, stable money to pull from. That shouldn't change based on your views or opinions or uncertainty about the market. You should have a plan that already accounts for, regardless of the reason, what if things get ugly in the stock market? Yeah. It's a long way of saying I don't let what's going on change what I'm doing personally or what I'm doing with clients, because we already have a plan and way to structure assets and how much is cash versus not. Because there's always going to be something potentially worry about, whether we know it or not, or something unforeseen, or someone drops a bomb unexpectedly somewhere and the world goes crazy. There's always something that can go wrong. Now is no different. There's a great book called Same as Ever from Morgan Housel, the guy who wrote Psychology of Money. If you haven't read it, read it. Fantastic book. It addresses things like this, amongst many other things. This time is really no different. The circumstances around what's causing the uncertainty may be unique, but what's going on now, there have been other periods in history where there's much bigger reasons to be concerned about things. And zoom out a little bit, and it's just another another reason to be scared that ultimately resolves itself. So anyway.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. And to be clear, I'm not making any changes based on current environment. I was just saying more talking from a general risk return standpoint, and just general for short-term cash needs. So
now people that do decide, again, let's hope you're not doing this simply out of uncertainty and emotion, but you do decide you need or want to hold a good slug of cash. Where do you think, or what options are there for folks, Mike? Is there anything else you wanted to add to like the other point? But I'm just kind of transitioning this into what to actually do with the cash when you have the cash. Thoughts on what people could or should consider with parking, for lack of a better word, the cash they're saving?
Yeah, and I think if you go back to, our friend Cody's use by date there, I think if you think about when you might need it, that really should drive a lot of this. And it also depends on the account type, right? As far as what you're limited potentially in, for what you can invest in and what you should be thinking about. Now, if it's none of this is investment advice, just to be clear, but if it's in a taxable brokerage account or a trust account, and you're in a state that has an income tax, you really want to think about the net after-tax return on that cash and not just trying to get the highest yield. It might actually be better off taking something that's paying slightly less but has more favorable state taxation benefits, or state taxation exemptions, or even federal taxation exemptions if we're thinking about like muni bonds, or even like muni money market funds. But so one that I like to use a lot are treasuries, individual treasuries, and just short-term treasuries for cash, because right now you're getting roughly 4.3%, give or take a little bit as of the day of recording here. But treasuries are not taxable at the state level. And so that's a really nice benefit especially if you're like live in California and you're subject to a effective tax rate of like 13.3%. If you're in the highest tax bracket there, that's a pretty huge savings by not having tax there for something that's basically equivalent to like a savings account. Treasury money market funds could be another great option there, just with less thought of having to purchase the individual treasuries. Just use a treasury money market fund. Typically those are just about, assuming they invest almost all of it in treasuries, just about all of that interest is also not taxable at the state level. But there's also obvious kind of the regular options out there. I'll call it more of like CDs, or certificates of deposit. You can purchase those either through a brokerage firm or custodian, or just through a bank. There's no penalty CDs out there. So if you want to get a decent rate, or kind of lock in a decent rate, but you may need the money 6 months from now, you can look at like a no penalty CD to lock those in. You could consider really short-term bond funds potentially, if you're willing to take a little bit more risk than like your standard like money market funds, or even just a high yield savings account. If you live in a state where you don't care about state income taxes, then maybe just a regular high yield savings account is another great place to put it. Now, I would, again, when we think about account type, be really careful if you're raising cash in like an IRA and you're like, I'm just going to, basically put it in a high yield savings account. That's probably a taxable distribution that you just made. So be really careful in doing something like that. That's not necessarily an option. You want to keep it within the IRA until you want to disperse it. How about you though, Andy? And anything else that you're seeing or utilizing right now?
No, I think that covers it. One other thing that some people think about or hear about or ask about are multi-year guaranteed annuities, or MYGAs,
Yes.
MYGA. Yeah. It's functionally like a certificate of deposit where you buy this thing for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, some designated amount of time. And it's like a CD. You put $100 in or whatever, and you'll get a known guaranteed rate of interest each of those years for 3 years, 5 years, 7, whatever length you choose. At the end of that period, you can take it out and do whatever you want with it. In that sense, it's like a CD. You'll get back your original money plus each year's worth of interest. One of the potential downsides is it is an annuity, so it does have a surrender charge if you take out more than typically 10% per year, there's going to be a surrender charge, and these things could be 5, 6, 7, 8% penalty on that. So it's more restrictive than a CD. Most CDs have minimal, if any, penalty beyond just foregoing some of the interest. CDs rarely dip into principal as a penalty. These MYGAs definitely can. So there's more to think about than just with CDs, but that's another option. And just another comment. So you mentioned the taxable accounts and holding things and paying attention to the taxability of it, especially at the state level. 100% agree. Be aware, if you do your own taxes, be aware of this and how these things are reported. Or if someone else does your taxes, make sure they're picking up on this, because if you have a money market mutual fund that invests solely in U.S. Treasuries, all the interest from that is tax-free at whatever state you live in. If you don't tell your tax return preparer of that, he or she may not look in the back pages of your 1099 from the brokerage account to realize and manually adjust, because you will have to manually adjust the fact that this is not taxable at the state level. So whatever tax benefit you thought may have gotten at the state level, you might not actually be getting if you're not making sure your tax return properly reflects it.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Literally, I was reviewing a return on Friday for a client whose CPA had prepared it, and still waiting on some. Anyway, normally I'm communicating the U.S. obligation interest. I communicate everything else, but tax preparer did not pick it up. This is an anomaly again, but I mean, it literally saved the client over $6,000 in state income taxes. Now, again, this was California. They had a lot in money market funds and stuff for some nuanced things that were going on in their life, but it can add up to a lot of money. For most people, it's nothing close to that, but just, right. But it's a great point. You definitely want to make sure that you calculate that, especially if the custodian is not reporting it for you.
Which is annoying, like TD. So my firm, we used to have clients custody at TD. Their 1099s did report every fund and how much of it was U.S. government obligation interest. Now, Schwab bought TD. All clients who had TD accounts were moved over to Schwab. Schwab does not report that. So you need to manually go to Vanguard's website, to Fidelity's website, to Schwab's website to download, and they make it all available. But you have to go look for it and download the government obligation interest to buy all their various funds. So it's a little more work, but all the more reason to make sure you bring it up to your tax preparer.
Well, and don't just assume that on the 1099, the consolidated 1099, it has, was it line 3, I think, on the 1099 INT is like U.S., interest from U.S. Treasuries or U.S. obligation. I can't remember the wording there. That may have a number. That's separate than what we're talking about. Right, correct. Because what we're talking about is what's actually embedded within underlying mutual funds or ETFs that you're invested in. You have to actually calculate that separately. And all of that is actually added as an additional subtraction on your state tax return, assuming that you qualify for it. So you really need to be careful on that. Don't just assume that because something is reported on that line that it's actually all of the subtraction that you are entitled to.
Great point. So yes, the 1099-int for interest, line 3 will report Treasury interest, but that's like if you hold Treasury bills, actually directly own Treasury bonds, Treasury bills, that interest gets reported there. If you own a money market mutual fund or an ETF, like a short-term Treasury bond ETF, the interest you're getting from those is technically dividends. And so that will all get reported on the 1099-div for dividend as dividend income. That's where you need to manually back out or strip out how much of that dividend income was from, shares of stock like Apple and Microsoft versus how much was interest from these treasury funds. And that's where, it's more work and room for things to go wrong there, or things to get missed, I should say.
Yep, absolutely.
What else have you noticed or think about or think people should know regarding, so we're in the thick of tax season, it's end of February. This was a great segue to talk about Treasury interest and making sure that gets reflected properly, but anything else, observations or things people should keep in mind as we're going through tax return season?
Yeah, you probably have more than me too, but just from the returns I've reviewed so far, one other thing that's come up a couple of times now here in the last couple of weeks that I've noticed is if you're still working, and especially let's say you're semi-retired and you have like a consulting practice, like essentially just a Schedule C or something, some kind of small business that you're running, maybe you're working part-time and making some additional income, be really careful of QBI phase outs. So QBI is qualified business income deduction. It's the deduction that came in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was passed in December of 2017. All that's subject, supposed to basically reset on January 2026 now. And most likely, I think, Andy, you probably agree with me, most likely all this is going to be extended, at least in some form at this point. However, QBI is basically a 20% deduction on your business income. And so what you want to do is you want to think about, really run the numbers to see whether or not you might be like in this really weird phase out range to where your effective tax rate is substantially higher than your actual tax bracket. Now, the two scenarios that I've seen the last couple of weeks, one of them was a client who was still working and actually had two younger kids and was actually eligible also for the child tax credit. And so basically they were in this phase out where they were in the 24% tax bracket, but making a SEP IRA or solo 401k contribution or actually saved that the effective tax rate was like over 57%, which is nuts. Wow. You think about you're in the 24% tax bracket. If you're right there on the border of some of these income thresholds or phase outs, you want to be really, really careful about what is your actual effective tax rate, because it may be substantially higher than you think. And so for that particular person, that makes a ton of sense to defer all they can to get back down to at least like a 24% effective tax rate. The opposite of that is true as well. So if you're earning income and you're making a SEP IRA contribution, you might be actually reducing your QBI deduction by making that SEP IRA contribution or solar 401k deduction. And so again, going back to like a 24% tax bracket, your effective tax rate might actually be lower than 24%. And so you just want to be really careful about that. The other scenario was, again, the exact same situation with the exception of not having any young kids. But I think they were at a 39% effective tax rate for any, essentially for savings for a SEP IRA contribution. And then that actually lowered them to get below the IRMA threshold as well. And so just by going a little bit farther for the IRMA threshold, that ended up saving another, depending on how much you end up contributing, I think it was like a 23% was the effective tax rate for IRMA over and above the 39. So you really, really need to actually run the numbers on all this. And actually, you can think high level that, oh yeah, I'm in this tax bracket, this is my tax rate. You really want to do the numbers when you're calculating your return, or if you have somebody else preparing it and you think you're subject to these things, just say, hey, how much would it save me to contribute X, or should I contribute X? How much am I saving by contributing to this retirement account if you're still working? The only other thing that I've noticed here recently that's a little bit unusual is actually a new California penalty abatement. It's a once in a lifetime abatement. So essentially, California has a law. I believe if you have, I can't remember if it's total income or W-2 income over $1 million, then you actually have to pay in along the way, as opposed to like a safe harbor of paying in, federal safe harbor is what, 110% of last year's tax liability, or 100% depending on how much your income was for the previous year. California is not the case if your income is, it's either income or wages is over $1 million. So you think about, if you've been working for a startup or one of these big tech companies and you got some really big restricted stock or something else payouts that were substantially bigger than previous years, and maybe your withholding was not even close to what it should have been. Maybe you thought you're in safe harbor, but you were nowhere close, and you end up with, I saw someone, for this particular person, it was a multiple $10,000 penalty for underpayment penalty that they're actually able to just basically waive because of this new one-time penalty abatement. This was just effective, I believe, April of 2023 when I was looking into it. So this is relatively new. So if for some reason you see yourself in that situation, Again, it's once in a lifetime, so I probably wouldn't use it if it was a $100 penalty to try to get a $100 penalty waived. But if it was something really big, that's something that's for the right person might make a lot of sense. How about you, Andy?
Nothing particular to this year. I agree with you with these phase out things, whether it's Affordable Care Act credits, whether it's a QBI deduction, whether it's how much of your Social Security is taxed. What makes tax planning and tax projections tricky is it's not just simply like you're in the 24% bracket, so every additional dollar of income is taxed at just 24%. Depends how it monkeys around with these other things. You may get more or less, credits or deductions or taxability of income than you otherwise would have. So there's no easy way to do this besides running it through a proper, tax return or tax projection tool, which makes things difficult. As general comment, a lot of people want their returns done ASAP. And depending what types of income you have and what documents you get, it might be better to wait. So, and this is hard to know with certainty, but like if all you have is Social Security and a distribution from an IRA and whatever, $100 in bank interest, like those things aren't going to change. As soon as you get those 1099s, which you should have all of those by the end of January, like that's it. There's really no other moving parts in your return. If you have a brokerage account and you have a bunch of mutual funds or ETFs, or especially REITs, real estate investment trusts, things like that are notorious for restating dividend amounts or qualified dividend amounts, or depending what we're talking about, after the fact. So even though you have a brokerage account and you may get the consolidated 1099 for it by end of January or February 15th, there's a chance it might get revised a week, 2 weeks, a month later. And so technically you have till April 15th to file a return, or you can extend it, no questions asked, for 6 months to October 15th. I'm not saying everyone should do that, but maybe it's not the best thing to file your return as soon as that brokerage account 1099 comes out. Now, I'm guilty of doing it. People ask, they want their refunds quick, so I do. Generally speaking, not too many get amended, partly because the stuff that I have clients invest in are relatively vanilla and not, high on the risk of getting restated after the fact. But it has happened where a couple times, handful of times, I did someone's return mid-February, and then early mid-March, a new 1099 came out, had to redo the return. Not a big deal, but just something to keep in mind. I don't know if you have strong feelings about when people should do, when they should file.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all situational. I think your tax, if you are paying a tax preparer, they may appreciate the willingness to extend.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, most tax preparers, especially ones that this is all they do, for their primary business, are probably working 12 plus hour days, 7 days a week right now. Try to go easy on them. They probably have more than enough clients, and so if you're pushing on them, they may just get it done just to kind of move you on, as opposed to really taking the time to go through your return. I think a willingness to, hey, May, June, July timeframe is completely fine with me, even if you have all your documents, may give you a better overall experience, and it may even give them a chance to, with a second set of eyes after tax season, to kind of look over everything. I even have a client that actually does his tax return twice. He self-prepares everything, but he actually does it during tax season, extends it, and then looks at it again in May and June. And I think that's another great idea, just to make sure that you're thinking everything through, and to make sure that you have all the documents and kind of a fresh set of eyes. So.
Good point. Yeah. I have a friend who his main business was tax return preparation. He's been doing it for 15 years. Absolutely crushed from end of January through mid-April. And so he had to, he didn't really have a choice. He'd have to have a lot of people do extensions. And sometimes he didn't really ask. He just sort of said, we're going to extend you. And that didn't go over well with clients. But to your point, it's hard. It's a terrible, not terrible business, but the fact that the tax return deadline is April 15th and documents don't really come out until end of January, it's there's a really small window where people got to get all this stuff done. So unless they have a small business where they're not overrun, or they are doing extensions for people, something's got to give. There's only so much capacity you can jam in the course of 2 months.
Yep.
Anyway.
Yeah,
What else you got?
no, I agree. The only other thing that I've had that's come up lately, and you might have some thoughts on this too, is data security, and especially data security in a world where AI is becoming more and more prolific. I think the obvious one, I continue to see people as I talk to them is don't have their credit reports frozen. Now we can talk more about that if you want to, but just basically there are three main credit bureaus: TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian, and you can actually go in there now for a number of years. But you've been able to just go in there and just freeze it, but what's called a freeze, and so nobody can access that credit report until you lift that freeze. It's now free. It used to be, I think, $10 to put these freezes on. But if you remember the big data breach for, I believe it was Equifax, maybe the fallout from that ended up having these credit reports for free. So that's a great way to kind of help secure your credit. You can actually consider freezing new bank accounts now. So you can actually prevent people from opening up bank accounts, which I recently learned about maybe in the last year or so. And you might think, well, why do I care if someone opens up a bank account in my name? Well, it's if they're trying to impersonate you. So let's just say they might be opening up an account in your name and then sending out an invoice or a bill, or trying to kind of bypass you and kind of impersonate you. And you may have no idea that this is going to happen. I actually have a client where they had no idea a bank account was open in their name fraudulently until they were actually going to apply for a mortgage. And the bank literally would not let them open a mortgage until they got the fraudulent account closed out. So, and that ended up being a bigger deal than they were anticipating. So just be really careful on that. But you got to be, I think, especially in today's age, you have to be really, really careful with what you're doing with all of our information. All of your information is out there, whether you're online or not. Your information is out there. I'm guessing, Andy, your and I's social security number is probably available for a nickel on the dark web, where and probably date of birth, everything else is on there. So you want to use really strong passwords that are, different for various accounts, and try to update them on a regular basis. Turn on multi-factor identification or authentication whenever possible. You want to review your credit card and banking transactions for unusual activity. Obviously, the big ones: don't click on suspicious links. Don't answer unknown callers. There's now software out there that literally, if they record enough of your voice, they can then use it to impersonate you. So if you don't know the number, don't answer it. Just let it go to voicemail. Avoid public Wi-Fi is a big one that I think a lot of people probably don't think much about when you're just in the local coffee shop using their Wi-Fi. Be really careful about doing that. You want to always use, ideally your data plan, or if you're using a laptop, try to tether off your hotspot from your cell phone. Try to think of what else. Oh, and then another one that I heard, which is kind of, I hadn't really thought much about it from a de-risking, but shut off your electronic devices when you're not using them. Right? You think about it, if you're literally, if the device is off, you're not connected to the internet, that's less time that somebody would have to actually infiltrate your system, which I thought was actually, it seems obvious now that after I heard it, but just, I think it's another good point, just something else just to kind of help minimize that.
Yeah, my iPhone's been on for the whole 2.5 years I've owned it. Other than once, I think it crashed, but otherwise. Yeah, great points. I agree with all that. Multi-factor authentication. I've been told by the cybersecurity place I work with that it's better to use a authenticator app as opposed to just a text, because it's easier for fraudsters to spoof your cell phone and get access to your text than it is for them to somehow hack into one of those authenticator apps. Credit freeze, 100%. I think everyone should do that. It's a little bit of an annoyance, when you do go somewhere that needs to run your credit, you get a new credit card account or you get a car loan or something, you'll have to unfreeze your credit temporarily so they can run it. So you just, that happened to me once. I forgot to unlock it and, got denied because it couldn't run credit. So not the end of the world, but you just, figure out how to unlock it and then relock it again.
It's easier than trying to get a fraudulent account closed, though.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I like what you said. Our information's all out there. Every one of us, everything someone could want to know about you is out there in the world. So it's not a matter of further trying to protect that. I mean, you don't be stupid with it, but you want to protect yourself. Knowing your info is out there, protect yourself from using that info maliciously. Another thing I haven't gone full steam into, But with the IRS, you can get a PIN, which means someone can't file a tax return as you unless they have that PIN, and that PIN changes every year. So I have a guy I used to work with, someone fraudulently filed the tax return as him for a large refund. So they got the refund and then, did whatever. He went to file his return and couldn't. The IRS said, someone already filed. He's like, wait a second. It was a nightmare for him to undo this.
Yeah.
And I don't know what ultimately came of it. I think he got it squared away. This was like 7 or 8 years ago. So it used to be the IRS would only give you a PIN if you actually had a data security issue with the IRS. As of last year, I think anyone can voluntarily get a PIN. I got one for myself, not yet for my wife. This is the first year I'm trying it out just to see how it works. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. But I'm almost like reluctant to tell everyone to get one because I think you have to get one every year. They mail it to you. I think you might be able to get it online in your ID.me or something. So I'm not quite 100% comfortable with it, but I completely get the logic and rationale behind it because you want to prevent someone else filing a return as you. Because if that happens, it's going to be messy. What else? Yeah, really strong passwords, different passwords. Use a password manager app because those things create like ridiculously long passwords. God, drew a blank here. I was going to say something about, hold on, it might come to me. Oh, people have asked, like, should they have different brokers? Like, instead of all their accounts being at Vanguard, what happens if Vanguard's site gets compromised or something? Yeah. Should they spread around their investable accounts or even their bank accounts at 2 different places? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. It's one I actually have not been asked probably in a year. So it's not as top of mind for me right now as it probably normally would have been. I feel like I had when, Schwab was in the news, like a year and a half ago or so. I don't know if you remember, just because there were some issues. And there was no issues with Schwab. I think there were some issues. It was it Silicon Valley Bank? And then it somehow got in there because Schwab also has a banking unit. The custodian side is completely separate. But I don't know. I think most people are completely fine. It's 2 logins you got to remember. I think there's other things you got to just think about. You got to, if you're doing RMDs, you got to make sure you're aggregating all your IRAs and taking all that out. So I think there can be cumbersome pieces of it. I personally have no issues with having all my assets at one custodian. Andy, I don't know where you sit on that. But basically, even if something happens to the custodian, as long as all the money is invested, you still actually hold the underlying positions, right? So even if they got wiped out, there's still going to be record out there of the positions that you hold. Now it might take a little bit of time for all that to get sorted out. So it's probably wise to have like a bank account or something that's not tethered to the exact same custodian, so you don't have everything in one place. But I think for most situations that would happen, you should be completely fine. But I mean, I don't know. Love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have concerns about the risk of my cash or my securities getting stolen. The concern more so expressed, or the question raised to me was, I think it was literally Vanguard 6 months ago or something, like its website got hacked or it was shut down. It was inaccessible. So like when people tried to go to Vanguard to do a trade or something, they couldn't. Now they could have called up and done it, but still, it was like an unnerving feeling that, hey, I can't get into Vanguard. And what if this lasts a week, 2 weeks, whatever? So I had a few people ask me, should I spread around my investable accounts and my bank accounts for that same reason? Not because they're concerned about the stuff getting stolen, but I just simply can't access it. I don't think it's worth it. The risk is there, sure. And I know people who follow Rob Berger, I think he's an advocate of have multiple banks, multiple brokerage relationships for that reason. Not stuff getting stolen, but just inability to access one of them. I'm not there. Maybe I'll get there at some point, but I don't know. Maybe I'm too gullible, and I think if something does happen to my bank, TD Bank is who I use, and Ally is, my savings account. Maybe I'm gullible thinking if they did get kind of locked down or frozen out, it's only going to be a couple days, and I'll be fine for that, right? If it happens for a month, different story, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, just I guess to piggyback off of that. So, in what seems like a prior life at this point. I started off in public accounting, and during the financial crisis, the team that I was on actually had a contract with FDIC to help close failed institutions. And so I literally have sat there in a quote unquote failed bank and actually been there right after they kind of put the lock on the door on Friday at 5 o'clock, tell everyone that, hey, you're fired. And by the way, you have to work all weekend and for the foreseeable future until we can like document everything. So I've actually been in that realm, which is just a fascinating experience to have just in life. But even going through that, I mean, yes, it's a hurry up and wait type atmosphere and everything else, but I mean, they're closing a bank on Friday and reopening on Monday. So I agree with you. I think the real risk is probably like some kind of cyber attack or something, maybe on the custodian, to where you just like don't have access to it in some shorter time frame. But ideally, if you have at least a couple of months of living expenses outside of that custodian anyway, like in cash, just like your emergency fund, even that, hopefully should get resolved. That's a long time for a cybersecurity incident to take something down. So,
right. And I think unless you're fully kind of running in parallel, this is going to be of limited value. So like your day-to-day checking account, you may have all your ACHs, all your bill pays connected to your main account, and you open up a second bank account just at a different institution, just for the sake of having, a different login to another account. Now, if your main one does get hacked and their website's down for 2 days, for a week, like, do you have all the connectivity and you actually have money in the other account enough that you can run for a month if you have to, with paying bills, with day-to-day comings and goings of cash? Like, probably not. And same thing with brokerage accounts. Unless you like really spread your stuff around fairly equally, having a second custodian with a second website to log into just for the sake of having access in case your first one gets not shut down, but frozen temporarily, may not do you much good unless that's fully funded and operational and connected to your bank accounts and stuff. So I get the theory behind it. I'm just not quite sold that it's necessary or worth, that the risk is worth the all the potential hassle and extra work with it.
Yeah, and if you're retired and you have like a home equity line of credit, maybe that's a great time for that to kick in if you ever had to. If ideally you have some credit cards with some capacity on it as well, to where you could, maybe worst case scenario, you don't pay the credit card bill off during that time frame. But most people, I feel like if they really had to, could make it work for at least some time period before it really starts getting, not that it wouldn't be stressful, but before it really starts getting, to where you're really going to be in trouble. So,
yeah. All right. I think that's all we got for today, right?
Yeah. Well, Andy, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation. So glad that Moose is doing well, and good luck with the rest of your tax season.
Thank you. And for everyone listening, if you liked this format, want to hear more, definitely let me know. Andy@andypanko.com. If there are things you'd like Mike and I to discuss in a forum like this, just to kind of hear our thoughts, definitely please email them to me, let me know. Or if you have any feedback whatsoever about this, let me know, and I'll definitely take it into consideration. So cool. All right, we will wrap it there. Thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for listening. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Andy.
Take care.